Hi there. Well, I'm so happy for being with you here in one more History of Brazil class in English. This is a very unique opportunity for you who wish to know more about the history of Brazil, but is not really able to learn about it because you will rarely find it in English. So let's start. In case you haven't watched our previous classes, please stop right now and start watching the entire history of Brazil in English, beginning with class number one, video number one. This will be very important so that you may understand the history of Brazil in holistic terms. I mean, as a whole, not fragmented. Okay. So now we will talk about Dilma Rousseff's presidential terms, the two presidential terms of Dilma Rousseff, who happens to be the first female president in the history of Brazil. This is also very important. Well, so here you have a picture of her in her first presidential term, okay? And Dilma Vana Rousseff served as president of Brazil from January 1st, 2011 to August 31st, 2016. So two presidential terms, as I said. Now, it is very important to emphasize the fact that Dilma Rousseff is a continuation of the Workers' Party project. PT is the Workers' Party acronym. Okay. So basically, Dilma Rousseff was referred by President Lula, right? And she, in a certain way, continued the purpose and the entire project of the Workers' Party in Brazil. Okay. Now, we must understand that her presidency is inseparable from the broader trajectory of the Workers' Party (PT), which had governed Brazil since 2003 under Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. However, we do uh, we do have to understand that before being president, Dilma Rousseff had a very unique trajectory, right? And we're going to now be talking a little bit more about this long, non-electoral political trajectory of Dilma Rousseff, which was rooted in activism, in technocratic governance, and executive administration. What do you mean by technocratic governance, Eric? Well, since her early days, Dilma Rousseff always showed an inclination towards non-human aspects of management and politics. Right? This is more or less, in a very summarized manner, the meaning of technocratic. Okay, and this obviously will impact her two presidential terms in Brazil. So let's take a look here very quickly at the pictures. Here you see, the background and political formation of Dilma Rousseff. Well, as I said, she was an activist during the 60s and 70s in Brazil. In this picture, for example, the one I'm showing you here, she is being interrogated by the military, okay, during the military dictatorship in Brazil. So she was really an activist. She was tortured, right? She was arrested. And here on your left, you have Dilma in, later on in her career, more involved in, I would say, management roles, right? Administrative, sorry, roles. Okay. Well, so before becoming president, Rousseff had no electoral background. She was known primarily as a technocrat. I mean, when you see this picture here, okay? Now, a former guerrilla during Brazil's military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985, she was imprisoned and tortured in her youth, right? Later on, she would build this public career in, not public career, sorry. She would build this career in public administration, even serving in as Minister of Mines and Energy, and later on as Chief of Staff, right? So let's delve deeper into, this background of Dilma Rousseff so we may understand the results, the outcomes, and the implications in her two presidential terms. Okay, so as a young woman, Dilma was involved in left-wing resistance movements opposing Brazil's military regime. As I said, she even participated and joined armed and unarmed underground organizations, right? She was arrested, she was imprisoned, she was tortured from 1970 to 1972, and she never hid, those events from the Brazilian people, from the public. Okay, now in the 80s, you will see a transition from this activism period in the 60s and 70s to, I would say, public administration roles. Okay, so she basically abandoned, right, revolutionary politics, and she embraced public administration. Firstly, in Porto Alegre, right? So she worked in municipal and state governments, right? She focused on economic planning, energy policy, and administration. So she was pretty much a woman of numbers, which contributed to this technocratic approach that she will clearly demonstrate and implement during her two presidential terms, and which, by the way, caused her many problems, as we're going to see, right? Well, in the 90s, she joined center-left parties, and eventually she even aligned with the Workers' Party, PT, right? So, as a continuation, she performed state level executive roles from 1993 to 2002. She was Secretary of Energy for Rio Grande do Sul in the south of the country. She oversaw during this period energy regulation, infrastructure planning, and public utilities. Okay, and she during this period she earned this reputation of a very competent administrator, a highly technical one, by the way, and she was very demanding. This is something that will also reflect on the way that she managed Brazil as a president in her two presidential terms. Okay, now from 2003 and 2010, she became part of the federal government under Lula's term. Okay, now this is where her national, I would say, political relevance really emerged, right? As Minister of Mines and Energy from 2003 to 2005, and she was appointed by President Lula himself. right? She was responsible for energy security, for oil, for gas, and electricity policies, right? So she played this major key role in responding to Brazil's post-rationing energy challenges. Yes, I remember at the time Brazil would have energy outages problems, and she was pretty much in charge of improvements made in the sense during this period in the country. Okay, well, later on in 2005, she became chief of staff of the presidency. So she became Lula's, I would say, closest management aide, assistant, right? She coordinated major infrastructure programs. She worked at the inter-ministerial policy, and she worked also on strategic government planning. So, effectively saying, guys, in this period, she worked more or less like a prime minister for the president of Brazil, Lula. So, this role made her one of the most influential unelected officials in the country, right? And even so, she never, before becoming president, had done, or participated in elected offices. She had never, for example, run for mayor, governor, senator, or deputy. She had never built an independent electoral base. She had never even led a political party. So it is clear that she really lacked this elected office experience, unlike President Lula, for example, right? So the way that Dilma rose to presidency was somehow exceptional. She was like handpicked and endorsed by Lula. And then she started campaigning, with this motto of Lula's continuation in terms of presidential projects. And obviously, that was very attractive for the Brazilian people at the time because they were very happy, or not all Brazilians, but many Brazilians were happy with the way that President Lula managed the country during his two presidential terms, especially the first presidential term, because at the end of Lula's second term, the world had changed a lot. And Lula, because of his style and because of the features of his management style and project, his solutions that had worked very well in the first presidential term were not working that well in the second presidential term because the way he managed the country depended a lot on the volume of work, on the success of the countries outside of Brazil, of foreign countries operating with Brazil. And that was not a reality anymore around 2009, 2010. I believe you can remember, crisis at this time involving such countries as Spain, even the United States, right? So the world around 2009, 2010 was much different in a worse way compared to the years of the first presidential term of Lula, which impacted his whole administration and project of presidency in a great way. Now, obviously, as I said, because Lula had this historical tailwind, especially in the first term, in the first mandate, Dilma suffered with that because Dilma, as she assumed presidency, she met a really worsened world in political and economic terms, right? So global commodities around this time, they were suffering a lot. Um, so when Dilma assumed, in her first term, commodity prices were peaking, right, and soon declined, right? So global growth slowed around the 2008 crisis. Um, so Lula surfed a good wave. Now, Dilma inherited a bad moment. This is crucial to understand. You know, this first term that I'm going to be showing you right now of Lula, you see here, this is a very suggestive picture. Lula often portrayed next to Dilma, having handpicked her and having clearly referred her along her, her election effort. Okay, so because of all these problems, because of this difficulty that Dilma had, to maintain things, to make all that Lula mechanism that was pretty much dependent on a good international scenario. Dilma suffered a lot because she didn't have this positive international scenario, and the whole Lula presidential mechanism was not working for her, right? So also Dilma, because she was very demanding. Remember, I told you that. Um, she was often intervening. So in Dilma, unlike Lula, uh, you had a president in Dilma often trying state intervention in a very aggressive way. She used public banks extensively to stimulate growth in an attempt, to make the Lula mechanism work. She would often control prices. She would directly intervene in regulated sectors. And these measures, in the short term, they ended up reducing investors' confidence. They ended up distorting price signals. And ultimately, they ended up increasing fiscal stress. Fiscal stress, something that the Brazilian people was really afraid of. Also along this first presidential term, you know, unlike Lula, who was more like a coalition builder, was very skillful in terms of identifying and finding um, partners. She was more like a technocrat, as I said. She was not really a political broker. Dilma was pretty much into centralizing power. She was a very rigid decision maker. She was not really into negotiating with the Congress, the legislative power, right? And that will be very costly for her because in a country like Brazil, with such a fragmented political scenario in terms of political systems and political parties, I mean, you have lots of political parties here. If you don't negotiate well with them, you can't govern, you know? So Dilma was pretty much focused on policy and underestimated politics. So in 2013, let me see if I have a good picture here. No, I don't have it. But anyways, in 2013, I remember that because I was working in Sao Paulo at the time. We had the first spark for a huge explosion in this first presidential term of Dilma. And that was basically the bus tariff. At the time, I really found it weird, absurd, that among so many problems, people were complaining because of a bus tariff that was too high. But these protests, these protests in 2013, they were like just an excuse. I mean, not the process were an excuse. Let me rephrase myself. The bus tariffs, they were just an excuse, you know, for the people to manifest, how angry they were with the way that Dilma was governing the country. How unpleasant it was to be under Dilma's guidance, right? So, these first uh, wave of protests in 2013 exposed the dissatisfaction of the Brazilian people, with the public services, with corruption. Yes, corruption, the monster of corruption that showed up sometimes during Lula's two presidential campaigns and two presidential terms, sorry. This monster was not dead. It was still alive, pretty much alive, by the way. And corruption was just going on. So Dilma, she tried to translate, this protest demands into effective political reform. But she couldn't do it, really, not in a proper way. So, as a consequence, the approval ratings for Dilma's first presidential term, they were low and they never recovered. Um, the congressional resistance towards Dilma was increasing day by day, right? And it was bad. I mean, it was bad. But even so, somehow Lula continued supporting Dilma, and in a very polarized election effort, I clearly remember that Dilma managed to overcome Aécio Neves and become re-elected in 2015. Whew, that was close. But that was a very bad sign because, as I said, the country was very much polarized. Many people dissatisfied with her that wanted a right-wing president back to power. And on the other hand, faithful left-wing voters who still believed her, you know. So we have this very polarized election, and very quickly, Dilma Rousseff faced deep recession. It was very quick, guys, very quick. So she tried some austerity measures, to try to gain control of the public administration, but she failed to restore confidence, and even worse, she weakened the political support that she used to have. So impeachment, the great monster of impeachment that hadn't showed up since President Collor. If you don't know anything about the President Collor de Mello term, you can watch this class here. But, since the 90s, Brazil hadn't heard about impeachment, but the monster was back. So the whole country, around the whole country, you could see images like this one, impeachment protests. And these impeachment protests became stronger and stronger and stronger, right? Initially, they were the right wing politicians in Brazil, they tried, they really struggled to formally base a process on alleged fiscal responsibility, right? On alleged fiscal responsibility violations. Well, Dilma and the PT political party always affirmed and stated that there were no such things. That what was really happening there was dissatisfaction, right? And this attempt to unlawfully remove her from power based on false allegations of responsibility, of fiscal responsibility violations. There were lawyers. So, man, it was very difficult to breathe in Brazil at this time because the polarization was so intense. And you would read the newspaper and you would read people affirming, yes, there is fiscal irresponsibility, and others would say, no, there isn't. And all type of data was used, at the time to, give the proper foundation to either of the versions. Well, the fact is that it really was a political movement, even if it was legally framed, right? There was a political process involved in her impeachment, okay? And the fact is that Dilma Rousseff's presidency represents this turning point in Brazilian democracy, and she ended up being impeached. And with her impeachment, many debates on constitutional order, on political accountability, democratic resilience raised. And to end this video, I'm going to show you a brief video on some of the scenes involving this Dilma Rousseff impeachment process. Let me find it to you here. Just a minute. Where is it? Just a minute. It was here. It should be here. Just a minute, guys. Right. I found it. I'll be playing the video real quickly, okay? Just bear with me. Okay, there you go. Ooh. You're not seeing anything, but I am seeing it, and you're gonna see it now. Great. Okay, let's watch the video then.
Dilma Rousseff put on a brave face as she entered the upper house of Congress to address the Senate and the nation, perhaps for the very last time as president of Brazil. But her message was emotional and sharp.
The Constitution clearly sets out the necessity for impeachment on the basis of a crime, an impeachment process which commits the violent act of removing an innocent president is called a coup d'etat.
Rousseff repeated her assertion that she had not taken money from public banks illegally to mask a massive public deficit, adding that Congress had sabotaged her attempts to lift the economy. But her arguments failed to impress her opponents.
Her government was a massive failure that led Brazil into an immense crisis. Inflation, recession, and public debt have all increased.
These may not be impeachable offenses, but they help explain why many who heard her speak were not moved either.
For sure, Brazil will be better without Dilma. I do believe that Brazilians will be happy again. We will find work. Brazil will develop.
There were small but vocal groups of Brazilians, especially from social movements, who marched towards the Senate to show their support for the leftist leader. Inside, she answered question after question, with former President Lula da Silva looking on grimly. But despite Rousseff's often dramatic and firm testimony, for many Brazilians, the issue is not technical or legal, but political. And in that sense, the president did not offer what some wanted to hear, and that is guarantees that if she is reinstated, things will be different next time round. Even Rousseff's staunchest supporters are indicating that her fate is sealed.
We are playing a game with marked cards where the decision was already made and different segments of Brazilian politicians want to take power without going through elections.
But in what was to be a marathon session, Rousseff persisted, warning that she would not go down without a fight and that history would judge them all. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Brasilia.
Very well. Let me go back here to our handout. Just a minute. Where is it? Okay. I'm trying to find it, guys, but I think I lost it. Okay. Let me put it there. Okay, I found it. Right. Okay, so to finish this video off, yeah, Dilma ended up being impeached, as I said, and now her vice president, Michel Temer, would assume presidency, marking another very complex and complicated moment of the history of Brazil. But this is a subject, is a topic for another video. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you here in the next video in which I am going to tell you a little more about the Michel Temer brief presidential term. Bye-bye.